Consistency is probably the most important thing that you can do with your podcast. And it's interesting because consistency is probably one of the markers for success in almost anything you do. Almost doesn't matter what it is. If it's health or relationships or, you want to learn a new skill, consistency is almost always the differentiating factor between success and failure. I've mentioned to you before, I went to Bible college. One of the things that one of my professors always used to tell me about learning to read ancient texts was that consistency is the only real test for truth.
Hmm.
I always liked that.
Cool.
And I think consistency is a really good thing to start with when it comes to your podcast. Welcome to PBP.FM, brought to you by Push Button Podcasts, your go-to resource for grabbing attention, building awareness, and creating authority in your marketplace. I'm Richard Matthews, your host and guide through the wonderful world of podcasting as a driver of business. Here, we teach how to use a multimedia podcast as the cornerstone of your omnipresent content marketing strategy. Whether you're an entrepreneur, podcaster, expert, or thought leader, you'll discover creative ways to leverage your digital content. From blogs to video, from YouTube to TikTok, and everything in between. I'll show you how to stand out from the noise so you can directly connect with potential customers, build strategic partnerships, and drive leads into your business. Get ready for actionable tips and tangible takeaways on improving your digital presence across the board. With that, let's dive into this week's episode of PBP.FM. Hello and welcome back to the podcast, the PBP.FM. I'm Richard Matthews and I'm here with Lucas. Lucas, are you there?
I'm here. Welcome back.
Awesome. Glad to have you here. We're on our second episode in the series of the 10 Commandments of Podcasting. So if you remember, our last episode was Commandment number 1, thou shalt have good enough production quality. Today we're going to talk about number 2, which is thou shalt be consistent.
We had some things to say about good enough production quality.
Yeah. Whole bunch of them. Spent like an hour talking about it. Let's see how long we go with this one. Our other commandments that for the rest of the series, we're going to talk about number 3 is removing the psychological barriers to recording. Number 4, driving to an action. Number 5, thou shalt buy, borrow, and build an audience. That's fun. Number 6, thou shalt gain attention, awareness, and authority. Number 7, thou shalt use multimedia. Number 8, thou shalt create derivative content. Number 9, thou shalt publish, announce, and promote. And number 10, thou shalt give good interview. So that's what we got coming up. And today we're going to talk about being consistent. And consistency is probably the most important thing that you can do with your podcast. And it's interesting because consistency is probably one of the markers for success in almost anything you do. Almost doesn't matter what it is. If it's health or relationships or you want to learn a new skill, consistency is almost always the differentiating factor between success and failure. I've mentioned to you before, I went to Bible college. One of the things that one of my professors always used to tell me about learning to read ancient texts was that consistency is the only real test for truth. I always liked that.
Cool.
And I think consistency is a really good thing to start with when it comes to your podcast. So what does consistency mean to you, Lucas?
Couple of different things. What I think that people think you're saying when you say be consistent, what I think other people think you're saying is have a couple of rules that you follow and follow them. And that could mean show up every week, once a week, right? So from an audience perspective, they're expecting you to show up once a week, every week. So that's being consistent. But there's more to it than that on the production side. So as a consumer, I want to see you show up once a week, every week. I want you to remind me that you're going to show up once a week, every week. I want you to tease me, right? So there's a reason why appetizers exist in meals. I want you to tease me to get me excited about the fact that you're going to show up once a week, every week. So that, because I live a busy life and I do things and I forget even things in my own life. And so it's perfectly appropriate for me to forget things that you're producing, even for my viewing pleasure.
For your benefit, yeah.
Right? So I want you to tease me, to appetize me, and to remind me that you're going to show up every week, once a week. So that's, I think, what viewers think of, consumers. I think that's what they think of as consistent. But on the production side, I think of other things, right? So, I have a podcast separate from this. On the production side, I think of things like, it's not just show up every week, once a week, and remind people that I'm going to show up every week, once a week, and tell them about it. It's also, I need to be consistent in how I show up. So, who I am when I turn on the camera, and what I look like when I turn on the camera, and how I'm bringing my message to my audience every week, once a week, right? So, we talked before about get on stage, demonstrate excellence, don't it up. To me, this is a number three. How I'm showing up consistently is don't it up. I need to make sure that when I present my message every single week, once a week, that I'm presenting it in a way that meets the expectations of my audience. And that includes the way I present. It also includes the way I bring guests in and allow
Mhm.
them to present to my audience. And then there's all that other stuff like we talked about lights, camera, sound, and backdrop in the last episode. So that also goes to consistency. And, I mentioned in a moment of vulnerability and opportunity for me to grow that when I'm recording my podcast in one of the other places that I regularly go to record, I'm using my laptop camera and my laptop mic. And so, in that respect, at least, I'm not being consistent. I'm not meeting the expectations of my audience to some degree,
Yeah.
but I am meeting their expectations in terms of showing up every week, once a week, and making sure that I am the best person that I can be, making sure that the content that comes through me is the best quality content.
Yeah. And so I agree with all those points. And one of the things that I think is really important, and we'll come back to this probably a lot throughout this entire series, and that's why you hear us refer to this rule number two, thou shalt be consistent, is that the consistency is more important than all of the other things. That you show up on a regular basis in front of your audience as often as possible. We like to use leverage to make that happen. So you don't actually have to show up every day, but you can still show up every day without having to show up every day, if you know what I mean. We'll talk about that a little bit more later when we get into derivative content and other things.
You
But
use derivatives, but don't be derivative.
yes, exactly. Which we'll define that for you when we get to what is that number seven? Number eight, derivative content. But consistency is such an important thing that if your camera quality is off one day, right, or your message is off one day, or if something else about your whole production, one way or the other, is off, if you have consistency over time with your audience, the missteps don't matter, right? Because you are building a bank account of goodwill with your audience, that it
Mm.
is okay to you're putting so much deposits in that when occasionally you make a withdrawal, it's not going to put you into a negative goodwill balance with your audience. Does that make sense as a metaphor?
I actually like it a lot. And it does make sense. Building equity. I think of it as equity, not balance, but they're the same thing.
Yeah. That you build a goodwill equity with your audience that comes from consistently showing up, consistently producing a good message, and consistently doing that over time. Now, that's one of the benefits of consistency. The other benefit of consistency, which I think is really important, is that the longer you show up, the more credibility and authority you build in the space. Right. So this is where the consistency over time comes in. Right.
Mm.
Because it's one thing to be consistent for 6 months. It's an entirely different thing to be consistent for 6 years. And that is a measurable difference in the engagement you have with the audience and the way people perceive you as a person and your authority in the space. I'll give you just a short example from my podcast, which is The Hero Show. I know you have your podcast Elements Community. Those are our shameless plugs for the day. I've been
I
running
have no shame plugging that.
not at all. It's a fantastic podcast. The Hero Show is a podcast that for me is entirely a networking podcast, right? That's what I run that podcast in order to build my own network and to talk to people that I want to talk to. And that's the purpose
Yeah,
of
but
it.
you're also having fun and your message is pretty cool and it's something that's core to you. It's not entirely networking. Like you're networking through a lens that you really appreciate and enjoy.
Absolutely. So not discounting any of that. My point is just that like my monetization goal for that podcast is networking. So as a networking podcast, part of the thing that I need to do is I need to get people to come on my podcast, people that I want to get on my podcast. When I first started out that podcast, the first 50 episodes or so, getting people on my podcast was difficult. And by difficult, I mean it required effort. It's not the most difficult thing in the world to get someone to say, hey, want to come and tell your story on my podcast? But I had to put effort in to make that happen.
I'm
And
still
I
in
got,
that phase. I still have to
yeah,
put in effort.
you still have to put in effort. And I got told no on more than one occasion from people in my audience that I wanted to come on my show that said, you just don't have a book of content that is impressive enough for me to say yes to. And those are people
Now,
who
did they
understand.
actually say that? Or are you
I
filling
actually
that
had one
in from
person.
experience?
I'm feeling that in from experience, but I actually did have one person who I actually respect a lot who told me that almost in those words. Because they were significantly further along in their journey than I was, and they were like, "Listen, if I come on your podcast, it's going to have a tremendous benefit for you and very little benefit for me, right, at this
Hmm.
point." And he's like, "Come back to me when you have XYZ going on, where it's more of a equal exchange of value." Not everyone recognizes that. He did. But my point is, at the first 50 episodes, I had to try. Second 50 episodes, I had to try a little less. We got past 100 episodes, something magical started happening. People started reaching out to us. Be like, "Hey, can I come and tell my story on your show?" Got to 150 episodes, it started changing quite a lot. And I had billionaire founders of tech card startups having their production teams reach out to us and be like, "Hey, can we get our CEO on your show?" We got past 200 episodes on our podcast, and I have a line of people in my email inbox that I have to filter and say no to on where we're coming into, because we've been doing it for years now, and we have an impressive large book of content that people now seek us out. And when I go the other direction and I look for someone like, "Hey, I want to have you come on my podcast," but like, "Hey, would you like to come on and tell your story on the Here Show? Here's 220 other episodes you can look at to see how we'll tell your story." And
Mm.
most of the time, people will just, without even listening to the episodes, are like, "You've done 250 episodes. You must be doing something right. Of course, I'll come tell my story on your show." You don't even have to listen to it, which is interesting.
At
Uh,
least lights, camera, mic, and backdrop.
yeah, every single time.
You're doing at least that much right.
I'm doing at least those things right on a consistent basis. And so the ease with which I can get people to say yes to coming on my podcast has changed, which for me, that's the result I'm going for, right? The result that I'm looking for, the result over time is that getting people to say yes to come and be interviewed on my podcast has gotten easier. And by easier, I mean, I can pretty much at this point get anyone I can get in contact with will generally say yes to me. If I can get over that hurdle of getting in contact with them, they'll say yes to come on my podcast. And I found that to be very true. And now I have two problems now that I didn't have before. One is that, how do I get in contact with, higher level people that I want to get in contact with, get them to say yes? And number two is, what do I do with all the people who are reaching out to me and saying, "Can I come on your show?" So I have to have a filtration process for that I didn't have to have when I started. And so consistency leads to results over time. What are your thoughts on that?
I 100% agree. I'm nowhere near 100 episodes, and it'll be a little while before I get there. But I started to experience a change in the requirements on me as the producer, right? Or as the host. I'm not the producer, you are. I started to notice a change on the requirements on me as the host as I approached 20 episodes. And it was exciting. All of a sudden, people started saying yes, or people who had said yes stopped brushing me off. I still have to reach out. Nobody's reaching out to me yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if that starts changing really quickly. I'm now at 30 episodes, maybe somewhere between 30 and 50 people will start reaching out. Not enough to fill up my roster. I don't think I'm going to have a line built at, by the time I get to 40 episodes, let's say I'll have a line of people that are waiting, but it might be to the point where it's 50-50. Like half of
Yeah.
the people that I interview came to me, the other half still were my outreach. And based on this, somewhere between 20 and 30, based on the change that happened between 20 and 30, because I'm now at 30 episodes, I'm guessing, I'm not there yet, I'm guessing somewhere between 50 and 100, my line's going to switch, and I'll only be outreaching for the guests that I meaningfully want, and I'll have all the incoming requests to fill in when I don't have like a specific target that I'm going after.
Yeah.
And I think that'll happen to me between 50 and 100. So being consistent, it turns out, is really friggin' important. For me, it happened, some of the shifts that you talk about, they happen between 20 and 30, and I can see that continuing to shift and to start paying back.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that is on the side of like getting guests to say yes to come on your podcast. But it has the
Yep.
same impact on the other side with your audience, right?
Yeah.
The people are going to start to notice a shift in, so like I've always been sort of talking about this whole heroic brand thing. So it wasn't a brand shift for me. But you have an interesting thing. You weren't talking about community before, right? And
No.
this for you was a new space that you wanted to build authority in, that
Yeah.
you didn't have before. And I know like I said, you're only like 30 episodes in at this point, but have you noticed a shift in the way people respond to and think of you and your expertise versus a year and a half ago before you had your podcast?
That's a fun one. See, you're 250 episodes in. That happened for you a long time ago. For me, it's
Hmm.
fresh. Yeah. So my first probably 10 episodes were with close friends. I mean, close friends, people that I know and love and care about, and or really close friends of theirs who were deeply motivated by the message and by the lens, right? By the approach and what the podcast is talking about. And that's it. They weren't there for me. They weren't there for my audience. They were there just because they wanted to tell a story through that lens. 5 different fire pits in a row. And one fire pit is orange, and one fire pit is purple, and one fire pit is blue. And who in the world knows why we have a blue fire and a purple fire? That's not what I'm talking about here, right? But we've got these 5 different fire pits. And you're like, I can tell a story in front of any one of these fire pits, but not all 5. Which one's going to be more fun for me today? And so for my first 10 episodes were that. I'm going to tell a story anyway. I get to just choose which one of these 5 fire pits is most exciting for me today. And people were saying, all right, you know what, Lucas? I'm going to choose the purple fire pit, which happens to be your fire pit, just because I feel like being in front of a purple fire pit today. And that sounds like fun. It had nothing to do with me. Between 10 and 20, it had to do with me personally. It was people that I outreached to. It was people that I went and said, listen, come on, I'm going to make you look good. Here are 10 episodes that prove I'm not going to f it up. And so they're showing up and saying, all right, he's working hard to make me look good. I'm down with that. Let's play. It still was just personally me. After 20, people started to say, you have something here. You've touched on something here. There's something magical going on inside of this. And I'm going to come to you. Yes, you did the outreach. You made it easy for me, but I'm coming to you, Lucas, because what you have is special. And I'm interested in playing in that playground because it's special. Now it's not just, I want to be in front of the purple fire pit today because that's going to be fun to me today. It's people who are like, I don't need to tell a story at all today. Like, I could just wake up, eat, go to bed, be happy. There's no reason for me to tell a story. Yeah, purple fire pit, that's cool. But Lucas, you've done something really cool. And you've motivated me to step out of my bounds. You've motivated me to come into this purple fire pit because it's really cool. And it's not just that I need to tell a story. This is really cool, and I want to play in this.
Yeah, you've invited them to come play in your playground. And I was like, as you know, because we produce your podcast, which means I listen to all of them pretty intently. I've noticed that shift in the conversation as you're getting further into these episodes. People that you're inviting on now are saying things like, you're the expert in community. So I'm really here because I want to talk about this with you. Right. Whereas earlier on in the podcast, you guys were exploring what is the idea of community and how might it apply. Now it's sort of, the message is shifting a little bit where people are like, you're obviously an expert in this space. Let's explore how what you're an expert in can improve my business and improve what we're doing, because I think it can, right? Because there's some magic there, right? And that there's that shift. The shift is you're creating that authority that we've been talked about, right? And that authority is coming because of that consistency over time and because of the good enough production quality and the not f***ing out of all the things that we've talked about so far. Like, it's working. Like, the things that we're talking about here, they work if you do them. And we'll talk about this more, right? We talked about this before we got on the call today. The magic is in the execution. It's in the doing.
It is 100%.
And
the magic is in execution.
Magic is in the
That's what
execution.
people are paying for. And
Yeah.
the irony is your guests are actually paying you, maybe not with dollars, but they are paying you. They're paying you with their audience, because when they do a podcast, they're sharing it with their audience. They're paying you with their expertise, their lens through which you're telling the story that day,
Yeah.
their attention and their authority.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that go into that. And to the point of this episode, results come with consistency over time. And so when we're talking about thou shalt be consistent, we're talking about all these things we're talking about with consistency, because we're going to talk about several things you mentioned earlier about how you actually do this. All of that comes with the caveat of over time.
Over time.
If you leave out the over time, it's not going to work.
Here's a lens for us to view this through. Consistency is really fucking important. Why is it not commandment number 1?
So I had this question quite a bit for myself. And I was like, why did I put consistency as number 2? Right. And what's interesting is I think 1 and 2 were the ones that I argued over the position on. The rest of them are just sort of in an order, right? They're not like in order of dominance. But no, 1 and 2 were.
Okay, so just to tell the story in my head, was there a good Richard and a bad Richard?
Sort of. And so let me give you that's a good frame for this. My good Richard and bad Richard for both of those. Production quality versus consistency, right? So let's just for the analogy here, good, the good angel is consistency over time, and the bad angel is, the bad Richard over my left shoulder is the production quality. And why would one be more important than the other? And I don't know that one is more important than the other, but, and we just had a toddler run through my screen. So the consistency over time ended up being the second one because if you get ignored, it doesn't matter.
Huh. Interesting. I like it. I see where you're going with that, but keep going there.
So if you get ignored, consistency over time doesn't matter. So you want to not get ignored first, and that's where the production quality comes in. So so there's a couple of pieces to that. One, you have to show up, right? That's where we're like making it easy to record and showing up and actually doing it on a regular basis. You have to show up. You have to look and sound good enough that your message isn't being missed by your audience, right? So if your production quality isn't there or your production quality is too over the top, your message will be missed. And that's the important part. If your message is missed, then it doesn't matter how consistent you are. And that's why the production quality got put first, even though it's this weird, it's like the technical side of it. So, but it's when you put those two things together, when your message isn't missed, when people can see you and hear you and they hear what you're saying, and you do that over time, those two things allow you to build the authority in your space. So we start with
I
production
agree.
quality. Yeah, we start with production quality because if you start with production quality and you do that consistently, that's where you want to be, which gets us into our how, the how for thou shalt be consistent. The first step in our how is you should have consistent production quality. Right. So we talked about what it was in our last episode, but the
Well,
first thing
good thing we covered that.
yeah, you should have consistent production quality. And there is a good reason for that. And you want people to recognize you by your work.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's a lot of things that go into that. And you mentioned this already, but like people recognize my backdrop, right? It's an ostentatious backdrop for me, right? It's an American flag. It's very like it's got messages and baggages that go with that. So people see that and they recognize it, right? And I've used that for a couple of years now. But the same kind of thing, if you watch all 250 episodes of my podcast, I have two shirts that I wear. I have this red one and I have a gray one. Those are the only two shirts I've ever worn on my podcast. They recognize those shirts. If I wear a different shirt, people notice. Right?
That's next level consistency right there.
Yeah, the only reason it happens is because I'm a minimalist and I live in a small space, so I don't have a lot of space for shirts. So I have my couple of nice shirts and my button-up ones.
Also,
and
if you're on the Red Sox, then you stop shaving and you don't change your socks in the after season.
yeah, and so this is probably something you could speak to better than I can because it's something you teach on. But there's stuff about being performative and showing up and in a performance mindset. I actually keep this shirt or my other one, depending on which one's clean, draped over the chair that I record in. I don't usually wear them.
That
And
is really reducing the barrier to recording.
So I will show up to record and I'll take off whatever shirt I'm wearing and I'll just put on my recording shirt. Right. Which works for me because, I'm doing the whole bust up, the 3/4 bust shot. So like, it doesn't matter what pants I'm wearing. If I'm wearing pajama pants or underwear or nothing at all, it doesn't really matter. The performance is the shirt. And so I keep this draped over my chair that I record in and I just pop it on and I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
There's probably something more to that, like mentally, that you could probably speak to a little bit. Yeah. Do you want to? I don't know if there's anything to that because that's not my area of expertise, but
there absolutely is something to that. So all of you put yourself back into the mindset that you were in when you were in high school, the good and the bad. Remember that when you went to gym class, there were a couple of steps that you went through in order to be in gym class. There are reasons for those steps. It's not just so that you don't sweat on your school clothes. Let's be honest. How many people in high school are smelling good all the time? Like the number's probably pretty small. It's not about the sweat. It's because for better or worse, and probably most people don't really know this, having steps that you go through to move into performance, and gym class is also performance. It's not necessarily on a stage, but it is performance. Having steps that you go through to move into performance helps your mind and body get into the frame of the performance that you're moving into. So gym class, sports, when you're moving into your musical equipment, and in fact, even when you go to school and leave school, I've taken all of those things and I've translated them into an adult mindset as well. one of the things that I think of when I think of my collared shirts, and I wear my collared shirts when I'm working, is I think of it as a performance uniform.
Yeah. It's a performance uniform. That's a good way to put it. So how does that relate back to consistent production quality, right? So you, for lack of a better way to think about this, are part of the production, right? So there is your lights, your camera, your microphone, your backdrop, and then the other part is you. So you have to show up. And so part of that is it's the performative part of like I put on this shirt, I do my hair, like I comb it, and I try to most of the time. And occasionally if I'm feeling especially oily, I even have some I don't even know what it's called. My wife got it. It's a makeup stuff that you put on your face that gets the shine to go away. And I don't use that often, but occasionally I'm like, man, I'm really shiny today. I'll just go and put some of it on. I had to learn from my wife how to do that. They do that on TV shows all the time anyways. If you go and do interviews on TV, they'll have the person that powders your face so you don't shine in the lights. But it's part of the showing up, right? So I make it easy to show up for myself. For me, the big things are combing my hair and putting on my shirt, right? And so I show up. It's part of the production quality. And then people start to recognize you for you, right? If you know Bob Ross,
Do you
he's got
do
the
you
afro.
also go into the mirror and say she sells seashells by the seashore and AEIOU and
I do not. I do not do any of those things. Maybe, but I don't. So,
so
um,
Bob Ross.
yeah, Bob Ross he's famous for the afro, right? The big afro thing.
Yeah.
One of the things that a lot of people don't recognize or know about this from him is
And
that it was
happy little
actually
clouds and happy little
and happy little
trees.
clouds. Yeah, is he's famous for the afro. The afro was I can't remember if it was a dare or a bet or something with his brother, but he did the afro for something, and then he became recognized for the afro, and then he had to keep the afro for like 20 years throughout his entire career because people recognized him for it, and he didn't like it,
He didn't like it. Oh my God,
and
that's
he didn't
funny.
like it. Right? And it wasn't until he got off of stage and he wasn't in there anymore that he could actually put his hair back the way he wanted it to be. Right? And so my point in showing up with consistency and having that consistent
You
look
know,
and feel.
you actually asked me a question about my hair this morning before we started recording. That's funny.
I did. Yeah. I asked you if the curls were intentional or natural, and you were like, they're a little bit of both.
A little bit of both. They,
A little bit
they
of
are
both.
natural, and I intentionally encourage them because I like them. This is the hair the way I like it.
Yeah. And so it's part of how you show up and have that consistent quality. Right.
Yeah.
And so that quality goes all the way down to who you are, and how you show up, because you want people to look at your work and look at your stuff and immediately know that's Lucas. Lucas talks about community, right? That's Richard. Richard
That's
talks
what I
about
want.
heroic stories, right? That's what he talks about. And I've got 250 episodes to prove it, right? That's the kind of thing where I got a friend of mine who does real estate stuff, Zach, and he does real estate growth hackers, and that's his podcast. And when he shows up, all of his stuff is machines, right? So all of the branding, and so he talks about real estate lead machines and real estate content machines and real estate, all of the things, the topics that he talks about are branded with some sort of machine. And so all of the graphics and everything have sort of like an electrical sort of like feel to them. And that's part of that consistent production quality, that you show up and the stuff that is yours looks and feels and sounds like you. That's what we mean by having consistent production quality over time, is that when people see your stuff, they go, that's Lucas, right? And there's something to that. We mentioned in the last episode, we recognize people by their face. We're really good at recognizing faces. Because you're not in person, you are doing asynchronous communication with a podcast and a video show. You have to help your audience recognize you by more than just the two-dimensional screen picture they're seeing of you. And that's where the rest of the performance helps them to have a frame that they can put that on. I was like, oh, getting very immediately recognized. This is Lucas. This is Lucas's performance, and his performance is about community, right? And there's a whole bunch of mental frameworks, depending on how much they've engaged with your content, that they're all going to be able to put into that box and recognize you for the message that you want them to be recognized for. That is how that strategic influence happens over time, right? And you're already starting to see it with that. And
It's very cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. And so that's the first one. Consistent production quality is your first how.
Are you ready to amplify your influence and stand out from the noise? Join Richard Matthews on pbp.fm as he explores the power of podcasting, social media, and strategic content to boost your reach. You'll discover the latest trends in video, audio, and influencer marketing, plus unlock insider tips to create binge-worthy content spotlighting you as a leader. With upbeat energy and clear, empowering advice, Richard guides publishers, experts, and entrepreneurs on starting a podcast, improving social strategy, and connecting with your perfect audience. Visit pbp.fm and book a podcast strategy session to start spreading your message today.
Second one is consistent schedule. And so the consistent schedule, I think, is interesting. And we'll talk a little bit about how that happens. In the ideal world, you show up every single day in front of every place your audience is, right? The audience you want. All the time. If they show up somewhere, you're there, right? People buy.
Yeah, that's what I
Yeah,
want.
that's what you want all the time.
That is what I want.
You want always to be there. Now, the problem with that is, can you be everywhere all the time? Not really, right? And so you're trying to build an audience. And, we talked before, Gary Vee, for instance, he has a content team that their goal is to be everywhere all the time. And he is everywhere all the time. They got 26 people on their content team last time I checked for VaynerMedia. 26 full-time, $100,000 a year positions for their content team. Show up everywhere all the time.
Yeah. I have $2.6 million to write as a check for me to show up everywhere all the time right now.
Yeah,
No.
right? So you can absolutely brute force showing up everywhere all the time. You can. You can brute force it.
For only $2.6 million.
It's like, and Gary Vee does it, and he does a damn good job of it, and everyone knows his name because of it. Yeah. Right? It's like, my son is 13 and knows who Gary Vee is. And he's not in any of the marketing spaces, but he knows who Gary Vee is. But that's you can brute force consistency, right? Where you show up everywhere all the time. That's the ideal world. So the goal is to be able to attract eyeballs to you and to your message and to the stuff that you want. Gary Vee is going for a mass audience. Most people aren't going for a mass audience. You don't care to get a mass audience. You might actually for your show, because you actually want to change the world with community. So that you might actually want to get there. My show, most people's shows, like I've got a client that does insurance, works in the insurance space. They don't actually care to have everyone. They don't care if 13-year-old boys know who their name is. All they care about.
Serve them at all.
Wouldn't serve them at all. There's 1,000 players in the insurance space. They want those 1,000 people to know who they are. And they want to show up everywhere that those 1,000 people show up every day. Right? That's really what we're talking about. Talking about showing up to your audience on a regular basis. So, ideally, if you're talking about content schedule, if you could build a daily show that you showed up in a consistent place, you will gather that audience faster than if you did a monthly show. Right? If you showed up once a month.
Well, only in calendar time.
Only in calendar time. You might have to explain that for our audience. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so calendar time is totally separate. What we think we care about on the production side is how long is it going to take me to build the audience that I need in order to be able to start monetizing it, right? Mm-hmm. Tell me I'm wrong. That is the purpose of being an authority, of being a thought leader. That's the purpose of having a podcast, is to be able to build an audience who wants to buy from you. And when we think about that in our brains, what we think about is how many months is it going to take of me being consistent before people are starting to be interested in buying the thing that I have to sell. That's calendar time. Now, what you just pointed out is if you could have a daily show, then you reduce the amount of calendar time, how many months it will take starting from now before people are willing to start shelling out dollars. But calendar time is actually different. It's an entirely separate concept from production time, right? So to have a daily show, your production time changes. And in addition to that, the payback, the earned value on that production time changes. So my guess is, and this is a guess, and you, Richard, you're going to be able to speak to this better than I can. My guess is that the value of your production time in absolute, in the number of views and the amount of people, and in fact, even the number of dollars that you get for that production, goes down as you approach a certain level of frequency. So what I care about as a business person is how many months do I have to wait before I start earning money? But I also care about how hard it is to be able to shorten that number. And a daily show probably is a whole lot harder to shorten that number than a weekly show or a monthly show, keeping in mind that I still care about how many months I have to wait.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So my point is that if you do a monthly show in calendar time, it will take you longer to get the audience that you want. If you do a daily show, it'll be shorter calendar time, but it'll be significantly higher production time.
Yeah.
So we're looking for what's our happy medium where someone who is maybe a solopreneur or has a small team or is maybe trying to break into a new space like you are and wants to create authority in that space. What's our happy medium that we can consistently show up and then use a little bit of leverage, which we'll talk about later, to get the benefits of a daily show without having to show up and do a daily show, right? Without having the increased production time. So my
So,
recommendation and the recommendation, go for it.
um, as we're moving into this, like all successful people, I have a coach that I work with. My coach, and this is why I said right at the beginning, it depends on what you think of it as consistency. I think of consistency with a certain definition. My coach actually has an additional definition, an additional wrapper that he uses around consistency. And his definition includes frequency.
Hmm.
And so to him, the idea of consistency without frequency is silly. Whereas what you and I are talking about, there's a difference between daily, weekly, and monthly. To him, being consistent and only showing up monthly is irrelevant. It's you're gone, you don't exist, you stopped existing sometime a long time ago. For him, consistency has to include frequency as part of the definition. Now, I don't agree with that, but I understand his approach, and
Yeah.
especially inside this context.
Yeah. What's interesting is you can look at shows like really famous ones, for instance, like the Tim Ferriss show. Sometimes he only releases one episode a month,
Yeah.
sometimes less than that. And yet he still garners a massive world shifting audience.
I'm not sure he'd be able to do that today, though.
Perhaps not, but he
He's
did
been
for
doing it
a
for
good
over
long
a
time.
decade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For a good long time.
Right.
um,
Calendar time is very large.
yeah. So my point then is that for us, we want to get a good mixture between the calendar time and the production time that we can actually show up and do the work and then leverage
Yeah.
it to get as much to reduce the calendar time and to increase our frequency. And so my recommendation and one that has worked consistently for our clients over time is a weekly show. Now, the weekly show works out really well for it's a consistency that we're all familiar with because of serialized fiction, right? And
Huh.
for those of you who don't know that term, serialized fiction is what you are seeing on TV when they're like, hey, every Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock on, major show like Friends is going to come out at 8 o'clock, right? And, or whatever the things are. It's a regular weekly thing. We're sort of trained for weekly stuff. We're trained for that from religious standpoints. Every Wednesday night, you got your youth group, and every Sunday morning, you got church. Or every what is it? Every Monday and Thursday this week, you do leg day at the gym. We think in lives in terms of that sort of like weekly cadence, right?
Every Thursday
Payday's
night is
Friday.
poker night.
Every Thursday night is poker night. So there's a lot of stuff that comes in from our culture that gives us a weekly cadence that we are already familiar with, and it's easy for us to consume and understand and just sort of plug into. I have not, it might be an interesting thing to study, whether or not that is as applicable in your cultures who are less event based and are less time based and are more event based. That's a really nerdy stuff for people who are interested in. United States and most Western cultures are very time based. Most of your Eastern cultures tend to be more event based. So I don't know how that applies in Eastern cultures or if it does, but for what we're talking about here or for our podcast, being able to plug into a weekly schedule tends to be very easy for us to do, right? Where you can say, hey, I want to show up and record once a week for an hour, maybe less than 40 minutes to an hour, 30 minutes to an hour, right? Depending on your content. Other nice thing about a weekly content schedule is that it's really easy to batch record, right? Where you can sit down with
Mhm.
maybe a couple of guests or like you and I are doing and record a few episodes over the course of 3 or 4 hours. You can say, hey, I've got a block of time here and I can record 4, maybe 5 episodes, depending on the month, and have the entire month's content done at one time.
Yeah.
So it makes it a high leverage activity where you can sit down, record, get several weeks or a whole month worth of content done in a short period of time. And then we'll get into how you can turn that into frequency when we talk about derivative content. But a weekly show means your long form content comes out once a week, is easy to record and show up. And essentially, you can get people invested in the time that you show up. Like, hey, I publish my episodes every Tuesday at 10 o'clock. They'll be out, right? And that gives you a lot of power and flexibility too. Again, because we live real lives and do real things, right? We travel and we have vacations, we have family and we get sick and, grandma gets sick and you have to go to the hospital, that kind of stuff. All that stuff happens, but you still need to show up consistently. If you're doing things like batch recording and have Tuesday shows and that kind of stuff that come out every Tuesday, you're like, when things happen or you got something unexpected happen, you can have a couple of extra recordings and not really miss your consistency. right? We can be like, I've got a few things happening in advance, and you can come back to it in a couple of weeks. Shit hit the fan. It's probably not going to work for you, but for the most, okay, like, the 80/20 rule, 80% of the time you can keep a consistent weekly schedule, even when things come up. And that makes it a really leverageable, even as a solopreneur, way to show up and create authority in a space.
I love it.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Your audience, yes, serialized fiction is part of it, but because of the fact that we live here in the United States, we live in a weekly world. And we do. I mean, it's realistic. Your audience is really, you have already mentioned it, trainable, and they're interested in being trained to receive on their schedule, and their schedule is weekly.
Yeah. So that's number two. Number one is consistent production quality. That includes you. Number two is the consistent schedule. And we're going to recommend weekly for most of the people who are doing this. If you have the team and the wherewithal to do a daily show, go for it. Right. It will be beneficial, but it will take a significantly higher amount of production time.
It'll be calendar time beneficial.
Yeah, but it'll be calendar time beneficial. It'll shorten the amount of time it takes to build the audience. And then the third one is to have a consistent content style. And the content style is the things that actually happen inside the recording, right? What you actually say on your show. And I've had this discussion a number of times with people, and I was like, man, you know what? Sometimes we have really good conversations. Too bad we didn't hit the record button, right? Too bad we didn't hit the record
Yep.
button on that. And one of the things that's interesting to me is while I find that to be true, that it would be useful to hit the record button and record some of these conversations you have in the wild with your friends and other thought leaders in your space. The problem with that content is that it doesn't follow a cadence. It doesn't follow a
Mhm.
consistent style. And because it doesn't follow a consistent style, if you don't share, like you and I might share, the common language and the common experiences and the common project that you're working on together, to use your community terms, it is
Mhm.
more difficult for an audience member to follow the conversation. So, when we're talking about consistency, we're also talking about having a consistent structure of content that allows everyone who interacts with it to follow the story, to follow the journey through and actually get the value from it. Whereas I know we've had a number of conversations on late night talking about random things like physics and goddess properties and all sorts of other things that without the context of our common community, an outsider might not be able to understand what's happening.
Mhm. Well, and in fact, you and I had to work for months and hours, potentially tens or hundreds of hours, in order to build that common context inside of our relationship. And the same is true
Mhm.
for the audience. You have to work for months and hours, potentially tens or hundreds of hours, in order to build that framework inside which your audience understands what they're receiving from your message, right? They'll be able to see that this particular episode is valuable for this particular reason. Here, the bomb drops, the gold that dropped here. And they can pick that out because of the fact that you have built that language through the consistency of your production.
Yeah. So when it comes to consistent content style, generally what I mean by that is you're going to have a structure that you're following and a structure that allows people to come along with your journey. And we mentioned serialized fiction. If you ever watched serialized fiction, I think most people probably have. Each episode has a story arc that they go through on the story, right? Where it's like if you ever watched one of those, solve who killed him, right? Who killed the person?
Hmm.
Because they all the shows they follow the exact same structure. It's like here's a random person you've never seen before. Here's some sort of problem that they have. Someone died. They discovered a body, right? Whatever it is, and then the people come into the crime scene and they look at the crime scene and then they go through and like they get all the evidence and then they argue about all the evidence and then they get the wrong person, always get the wrong person first, and then it's it actually the who done it was some person that would have been glaringly obvious if only you had all the information at the beginning, right? And like they follow that structure over and over and over again, and for each type of show they have that sort of like a story that they're following over the thing. And then they have the larger story that goes across the entire serialized fiction, which generally involves the characters and the metaphors and everything that they're sort of driving through across all their little miniature stories. So we have, again, because your audience is trainable and because we expect these kind of things, and this is how we learn and take in information, the same kind of structures where you have an internal structure for your episode, for your content. And that structure fits into the larger story that you're telling, right? So for you, the story that you're telling is about the structure of community and how community actually works. And then inside of each one of your episodes, you're following a particular structure with your guest to talk about how that story of community fits into their business, into their life, right?
Hmm.
And on my show, we
It's
talk a
almost
lot
like you've
about,
listened.
Yeah, it is. It is almost like I've listened. On my show, on the Hero Show, we talk about how we're trying to shift the narrative of entrepreneurs being culturally perceived as the villain to being perceived as heroes, because that's really the way, reality works. And what we do on each episode is we go through a couple of story structures that talk about their story as if they were a comic book superhero. And we use the comic book superhero tropes like superpowers and fatal flaws and tool belts and that kind of stuff. And so we have a structure that lends to the larger story. So when it comes to having consistent content structure, a consistent content style, I'm going to give you a really simple one that we're actually using right now that you can go back and listen to these episodes and see if you can pick up on it, that I call the WIN formula. And it's spelled wrong. It's WWHN, WIN, WHN. It's what, why, how, now. And I use this structure a lot. It's really good for copywriting. It's really good for telling stories. It's good for a lot of things, but it's really good for putting together a consistent content structure that's just easy, that you don't have to worry too much about. And so the WIN, the WHN, is what, why, how, now. And you've heard us go through this on these things. What are we talking about today? That's the first question. So when we talk about, we'll get into this, giving good interview even to yourself, you can present your own stuff as questions to yourself. What are we talking about today? We're talking about the second commandment of podcasting, which is thou shalt be consistent. And we talk about why is that important? What were our reasons, right? Our why for why is it important to be consistent is, consistency over time and for people to be able to receive your message. And then we talk about how, right? What are how do you be consistent? And then we've talked about three things: consistent production quality, consistent schedule, and now consistent content style. That's the how section. And the last
Mhm.
one is your now, is where you come in with your perspective and your story and everything to share either case studies or examples or stories that drive the points home that you've made. And that is a formula that's, one, really easy to remember. And you can go from very large content like we're doing here. We're doing hour-long episodes talking about these things. They could be very short TikToks, right? Where you could have a 3-minute TikTok thing that said, hey, what's the second commandment of podcasting? Well, it's, consistency. And why is it important? Because it'll get you results over time. And here's 3 things that you should pay attention to. Your production quality, which includes lights, camera, backdrop, blah, blah, blah. And your consistent schedule. And here's what that looks like. And consistent content style. You could do that in 3 minutes and follow that same what, why, how, now structure. And I found it to be really
Did it in
flexible.
45 seconds.
45 seconds, yeah. So, I mean, I said blah, blah, blah a few times, but
You did say blah, blah, blah.
I did. But it's a tool that I give to clients regularly that they're like, oh, I never realized that I could. I think the biggest thing it helps clients with is getting over that blank page syndrome of what do I say when I hit the record button. And so if you have a topic, you can have a consistent content structure, and that content structure can help you lend to tell your larger story. So that's just one example. There's lots of ways you can do it, right? If you listen to my show or your show, you'll see we have a different sort of structure that goes into the interviews that we're doing. But
Yeah.
the important part is that the structure is consistent and people show up and they expect the structure to happen. And so that they can just see if I can make another metaphor here for you. One of the reasons
I have
why,
one.
go for it.
So somebody recently asked me a question that it took me a while to answer, but I did eventually come up with an answer. I called him back. I was really excited. I got the answer. I figured it out. The question was, why is it that we don't just use a video recording of the best physicist teaching physics and share that to people over the world as their physics instruction? Again, it took me a while to come up with the answer. The answer is because it doesn't matter. Number one, how do you define the best physicist? Really important question. But number two, it actually doesn't matter if that person is the best. What really matters is if that person is the best for me. And the best for me isn't defined in one interaction or even 2 interactions. It's defined in 200 interactions. And so the best instructor that I'm ever going to get is somebody that I can spend a lot of time with. The best instructor that my audience is going to get is somebody they can spend a lot of time with as a content creator, as a producer, as a host, as a podcaster. There could be 10 other people that are talking about the exact same thing that I'm talking about, and my audience will choose me not because I'm the best, but because I'm the best for them.
Yeah. And I think that lends well to the metaphor I was going to make. And maybe it's not a metaphor, it's an example. It's probably the right word. Is McDonald's got really famous as a restaurant for a couple of reasons. But one of them is they sort of built up over this when we built our road structure throughout the US and everyone started getting cars and started traveling around. And so there's things like, oh, they had the drive-through, which is really cool. And they had, they did a couple of things. They did a lot of things right. But one of the things that they did really right was that it didn't matter which city you went into. If you go into a McDonald's, you know exactly what you're going to get. And they still sell that to this day, that no matter where you go, if you go to McDonald's, you know what the burger's going to taste like, you know what the fries are going to taste like. There's no unexpected aspect of McDonald's. You know what you're going to get. There's a consistency to it that we appreciate. And I have on more than one occasion that I would, less than proud of, right? It's like, we just need to get food in our systems, and we don't want to have to like guess on what's going to happen and whether or not it's going to be like satisfactory calories. Right? We can argue whether or
I
not
don't have
McDonald's
the energy to decide
calories.
right now.
Yeah. I don't have the energy to decide. McDonald's is there. I know exactly what's going to happen at McDonald's. Right. And that is a perfect example of what we mean by consistent content style, is that when people show up to your content, they don't have to put brain power into understanding what's happening. They can just receive the content, receive the message that you want to give them.
Yep.
And that's part of what a consistent content structure does for you, is it gives them the consistency, again, that mental framework they could hang your content in. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So sometimes the best is a surprise that is delightful. Most of the time, the best is not actually a surprise that is delightful. Most of the time, the best is exactly what I expected.
Yeah, it met my expectation, right? And that's what you're looking for, is you want to create that consistency. And to get back to that content structure, both of this examples that we just shared fit into that now section. We talk about what, we talk about why, we talk about how, and then we give examples that help drive the content home. That's the now. And that is a really useful content structure for you to follow and create content for your podcast and be able to, follow the second commandment, which is thou shalt be consistent. And that's all I've got to say on that subject. How about you?
Yeah. Don't f it up.
Don't show
Don't
up
fuck it
consistently over time. And, you want people to recognize your work. You want people to have a consistent content structure that they can follow. Anyways, good stuff. Which brings us to our next episode, which is going to be on number 3. The third, what am I calling these again? The podcasting rules, the 10 commandments. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for. The 10 commandments. Third one is thou shalt remove the psychological barriers to recording. Some of these things we've talked about already, but we're going to get into some real specifics on how you can actually set it up and make it show so it's easy to show up and record on a regular basis.
Love it. And we talked about that a little on the lights, camera, mic,
Action.
backdrop.
Yeah. So we're going to come back with some tools for you next week on how to make that really easy. And we're going to show you how to take the stuff we talked about so far. That's why this is actually number 3, is like, so now you have the framework for them. The third one we're going to get into, and we're going to give you like some specifics and some tools that you can actually like go forth and start creating content libraries and content structures and a mini studio that will fit in a bag, the whole bit, so you have it all ready to go and you can start doing the work, because it only works if you actually do the work.
It only works.
So join us in that episode. Yeah. Again, we'll probably mention this a lot. The magic is in the doing.
It is. Execution.
Awesome. Well, join us in the next episode. Thank you, Lucas, for being here.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining us this week on pbp.fm. Make sure to visit our website, pbp.fm, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or via RSS so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. And if you'd like to get help building an omnipresent content marketing strategy with a podcast and you want help, you might want to book a podcast strategy session with us at pbp.fm. Just click the Book a Strategy Session button and book a time on our calendar. We look forward to speaking with you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.